Guys.
No, we're live.
Okay, hello everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. I don't know who is listening to us. Um, it is the second session of our conference. We started this morning with a, a presentation that I made, and Andrea made a presentation about Cavell. And for this afternoon, we have a talk called Cavell and the Everyday of Thinking with Eric Ritter. I will introduce him in a minute. So perhaps we will uh, put you all backstage now. Okay, so see you soon. Just a minute. Oh, Richard is here. Hello, Richard. So, okay. Uh, Thanks, everybody. I want, this is not the opening. We already had the opening, but I just want to say to everybody, since we're speaking English now, that I'm very happy to be the co-host of this conference. Cavell is very important for myself in my own work, and I think especially in Brazil, we are just beginning to investigate his work. So it's great to have you all here. Arata is arriving. Hello, Arata. And we will start with Eric, and he will present a short talk about his work with Cavell's literary legacy. Eric Ritter is a scholar writer activist. He received his PhD from the Vanderbilt University Philosophy Department in 2019, and he has been a visiting doctoral fellow at the University of Chicago Center for German Philosophy and the Freie University of Berlin since 2017. In addition to his scholarly work, he has worked on various research and policy coalitions around justice reform in Greater Nashville. He's currently lecturer and visiting scholar at the Vanderbilt University Philosophy Department. So, Eric, it's a pleasure to have you here, and I will leave you with the floor, so to speak, and after your talk, we will get back for a conversation. Should I put your presentation on screen?
Sure, that would be wonderful.
Please go ahead.
Do I have the power to change the slides, Leonidas?
Yes. Whatever you do on your screen, we will see here.
Great. Well, hello, everybody, and thank you for coming. And Leonidas, thank you so much for organizing this workshop. This is going to be just a brief presentation. As I'm sure everybody here knows, Stanley Cavell died in 2018, and his wonderful family was looking for some help at the time, from graduate students or very young postdocs to help organize his papers so that they could have a sense of what was there before donating or giving Cavell's papers to a archive or research library. So I had the amazing opportunity to help the Cavell family kind of inventory and organize Cavell's literary estate. And I think that in many ways I'm still processing everything that I learned from being so intimate and close with Cavell's everyday process of writing and working and thinking. And I'm looking forward to sharing some photographs and saying a little bit about the project that I did there, and then to having a discussion with you all about it. So the title of my talk is Cavell and the Everyday of Thinking, and this is where Cavell wrote in Brookline, Massachusetts, in short walk to Harvard University, where he worked for over 50 years, or a short drive, excuse me. And the study that this photograph or the majority of the photographs you're about to see, this is where he lived and wrote for 50 years. So there was material all the way back from his graduate school days. And this window right here is overlooking a walking path that can take you straight to Fenway Park. And you could even hear the cheers sometimes coming from that baseball stadium. So let's go ahead and get started here. From June 2019 to March 2020, thanks to a generous grant from Vanderbilt University, I worked with the Cavell family to organize and archive the Cavell literary estate. In the process, I think no one was quite expecting this. I found a surprising amount of uncollected and unpublished material and documented it along with the executive of Cavell's literary estate, Kathleen Cavell, who many of you know perhaps, and her son, David. This work got interrupted because of COVID-19, so as you can see, this project sort of stopped in March 2020. I will come back to this at the end of the talk. Again, this is Cavell's primary writing desk, So here's a photograph of the study as you walk in. As you can see, there are quite a few books. This would be if you're standing where that writing desk was, more or less, and looking back out. And you know, when I arrived in June of 2019, there essentially nothing had been touched since Cavell passed away. And yet the strange thing for me, and unlike some folks here, Arata, and I don't know if Jim is here, and others who worked closely with Cavell and who knew him quite well, I had the chance to meet him once. I did not know him very well. But the strange thing about this project was that it really felt like he had just gone out for a cup of coffee. I mean, very little had been touched in his study, and I could see why the Cavell family needed someone who knew Cavell's work and who had some time and you know, did not yet have a family and so forth, because the project was really enormous. Nothing had been touched. There was no yet organization or any kind of order given to Cavell's papers, and so my first step was to basically ask the experts. So I had extensive conversations with the Vanderbilt librarians, special collections in particular, who were wonderful with their time and who had done projects like this before. And they walked me through, you know, in terms of materials that needed to be purchased, in terms of how to go about doing this. The next thing I did, or really at the same time, was ensure that all digital files were backed up. That actually had not yet happened, so I, you know, made sure that we weren't going to lose anything. The community that cares about Cavell's work. And finally, what I did, and sort of what you're looking at now, is I took photographs. I spent 2 or 3 days taking photographs of everything in the study before I had, you know, even started to move anything around. The idea here being that perhaps those who for whom this was important could take a look at those photographs and, you know what the study looked like before I made any kind of hint. Also, it's just sort of lovely because it shows the condition of the study at a time close to when Cavell was using it. So this is another photograph that shows you the back of the study with the computer desk there, as well as those file drawers. Those file drawers became my close friend because they were filled to the brim with papers that needed to be inventoried and organized. One thing that's worth just pointing out is this back wall here was really sort of like a reference library. This was, I would say, the kind of history of philosophy section of Cavell's study. Stuff that he wasn't using every day, had fewer marginalia, fewer annotations, but it was stuff that you could just see him walking back, you know, and consulting it. It really felt like here was his personal library of really largely the history of philosophy, that back shelf in particular. So many texts, both primary and secondary, you know, and of course, as everybody here knows, the wonderful thing about Stanley Cavell's work is that it's not just one tradition. So, in addition to classics of 20th century analytic epistemology, we also had, sort of the history of Jewish philosophy and the history of continental philosophy. So it was that broad-minded, that various fields that Cavell worked were really on full display in his study. Here's a little bit of a close-up on his computer desk. Obviously, for most of his life, he did not use a computer, but certainly, let's say for his autobiography, he wrote primarily on his computer. But he wrote a lot by hand, even towards the end of his life. In fact, I would say the majority of materials in the study were by hand. And here behind the computer was a sort of German philosophy shelf. Works of Arendt, Heidegger, Nietzsche, Schiller, Simmel, Schullum, Benjamin. And many of these books, just to think about what's in our future as those who love Cavell, just full of his lively, vibrant annotations. And I can talk a little bit more about what I saw in terms of the annotation style and his practice of taking notes. Here, again, as I mentioned, these were my close friends. These 25 file drawers full of paper files. They really testify to almost 70 years spent teaching, writing, and thinking. You can see that I numbered these files because, with advice from Vanderbilt Special Collections librarians, every file that I took out, I made it clear where I had found it in the study, including which particular drawer. And for the stuff that was harder to find, which I'll talk about in a moment, there was some organization system here, but it was certainly not organized by, in any kind of systematic way.
Eric, sorry, but okay, we were not seeing the file, so okay. Probably.
Thank you,
Now
Jan.
You're welcome.
I had forgotten. Please let me know if I do that again, because I'm doing this with two screens here.
Yes. No worries.
So here are the file drawers, and here you can see the numbers that I used, and you can maybe just get a sense of just the volume of paper that was sort of everywhere. So here is just another table in his study, full of papers, miscellaneous items. This ultimately, we used this table to basically keep track of what, for those of us Cavell scholars, might be the most precious materials. So his copy of J.L. Austin's How to Do Things with Words, his copy of Emerson's essays, the investigations, Being in Time, and so forth. These well-loved books that the spines were quite literally falling off. So that's primarily what I ended up using this table in his study for. Here, excuse me just one second. Here, this is another example of, this was a shelf that's more in the middle of the room. Here's a copy of Austin's How to Do Things with Words, kind of hidden there. One thing that I was slightly surprised by is, Cavell didn't seem to have one prized copy of any of his favorite thinkers. He definitely worked in various editions in various texts. And here, here's a copy of Schopenhauer next to a copy of Levinas, and I think it's pretty clear that this shelf in particular was materials he was using when he was writing some of the essays for Philosophy of the Day After Tomorrow. So here's a sense of what the floor of the study looked like, by the end of that first summer. There were 24 archival boxes full of paper files sorted by by categories provided to us by the librarians, as well as about half a dozen or more of these smaller archival boxes, which are acid-free to protect papers that are older or more fragile. So this ends up being, more than 20 linear feet of paper. It's quite a bit. Each box, or most of the boxes, had an inventory that I created, as well as inside each box has this blue file folder that says where in the study the papers were found. So within each box, which is itself organized by, as you see, archival category, it's also possible to trace back where in the study I found each individual paper. As many of you already know, the study is not the only room in the Cavell's house that is full of books. Here's an example of a different room in the house, which I'm not showing all of for privacy reasons, but this is sort of like the French philosophy shelf. So here we have Derrida and Foucault, and clearly work that he was using for the Melodrama of the Unknown Women book in the early 90s. Another thing and here, got ahead of myself there. Here's the music room. Several wonderful photographs of Cavell and or him standing by this piano. Music was obviously so important for Cavell, especially in the last decade of his life. He wrote a lot about music. He studied music regularly. These are musical scores here, not just classical, but also jazz. And even, a lovely note is, even toward the end of his life, as his memory faded, Cavell never lost the ability to play jazz show tunes on the piano. And there are some recordings of him at the piano, and those of, was not lucky enough to have him as a teacher, but I have heard stories of him, walking over to the piano during class. Here is perhaps maybe the most exciting thing, in my opinion, that will be a part of Cavell's literary estate. This was the shelf closest to his desk. So if you recall back to the first slide with the bay windows, this was, if you're sitting in a chair, directly to the right. On top here are all of Cavell's own books, which, especially towards the end of his life, and I have the sense not just towards the end of his life, he was regularly rereading and consulting. The sort of autobiographical, self-referential style that all of us know so well has a kind of physical analog here in this top shelf. They're also filled with his notes, and you really could feel in this respect and in many others the perfectionism, the ethical practice of reading and writing philosophy. And another thing worth pointing out, also extremely, I think, exciting from a scholarly perspective, is dozens and dozens of journals here. If you've spent time with the journals of someone like Emerson or Thoreau, to my mind, they really called to mind that kind of daily practice of writing, working on form. He would clearly lift sentences from his journals and put them into his finished work, just like Thoreau and Emerson. Excuse me for that. In the journals are not just reflections on the history of philosophy and what he's reading, although they are that. He's also working through, everyday life and ordinary experience, often with the help of texts and figures from the history of philosophy. So as you might imagine, I learned Cavell's handwritings because they are quite difficult and challenging, and they also changed over time. So this is just a really exciting part of his study. Here's just a photograph of what his desk looked like with a little more clarity. Before doing anything in his study. It's a photograph of what his desk looked like. He had, not only many of his own books to his side, but also right there on the desk. And ultimately, I'm moving towards the end here. I'm looking forward to a conversation. Ultimately, during this process, I found unpublished or unfinished writings on Austin, Dewey, Derrida, music, psychoanalysis, Shakespeare, and more. I also found a volume called Here and There, Sites of Philosophy, which Cavell made extensive plans to publish in the late 1990s, but never in fact did. Throughout his study, there were 4 slightly different tables of contents on the volume, as well as extensive correspondence with his editor about it. At the same time, he was working on his autobiography, traveling back and forth to Chicago, preparing Emerson's Transcendental Etudes and Cavell on film. And so I think this book of essays, Here and There, Sites of Philosophy, just sort of slipped through the cracks. He clearly wanted it to come out, and ultimately several of the more well-known, at this point, obviously well-known essays were published in Philosophy the Day After Tomorrow. Nevertheless, across the 4 tables of contents, there were 13 essays which had never been published before, never been published in English. And Here and There, Sites of Philosophy is now in the process of posthumous publication. So that was an extremely exciting find. And that just brings us back to this writing desk. And I will just say, I don't think this would be news for many people here, but one thing that was quite resonant after doing this work was the, let's say, the ever-present nature of ethics and of perfectionism in what Cavell was, and moral perfectionism in Cavell's sense of philosophy. It was so clear that the reading and writing meant something to him, something more than just a puzzle or a status symbol. I think it was so clear that his practice of reading and writing philosophy moved him from here to there, from one next to another, to use the language of Emersonian perfectionism. And I'll just end with this note, which was, strangely, getting so close to one of, my personal philosophical heroes after his death, it became clear that imitating him would lead nowhere, as his conception of philosophy was firmly rooted in something close to his own life, his own personality. His final gift was to have successfully, utterly left me to myself, while still serving as an exemplar. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. That was great. Let me put some people back here, and then perhaps we can start a conversation. If you prefer not to, just let me know. Let me take the presentation off. And I just want to say, perhaps in order to start, is that in my own case, I also never had the chance, or you had once the chance of meeting Cavell. I never had that chance. So for me, we already discussed a little bit this before, and Eric showed me some of those pictures before, and it was just, an amazing experience for me to feel a little closer to the man, to his work, actually, because basically all I know about Cavell is from his writings. I don't even know that much about his personal life, and it was quite nice to have this secondhand, at least, experience of seeing where he was working and what he was working on. Um, I perhaps would have one question, but I'm not sure if you can, if you have if you thought about this. But you said something in the beginning about his change from writing by hand and writing on his computer, and this is something that I am personally interested in. If you notice, if you can perhaps notice some kind of difference in style or content because of that change in material conditions for writing. Because in my own life, I basically, since the beginning of my studies, as I was writing on a computer. So, as you know, we can just copy, paste, change everything. Um, there is no need to think that much before you commit it to paper. So there is no paper to commit it to, and I wonder if that it's something that you notice, some change in Cavell's style because of that, or if not. Or if he just kept doing what he was always doing, only in a computer now.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I guess one way to start thinking about that, he certainly edited a lot by hand. I think even when he was writing on the computer. So even the many drafts of the autobiography, clearly he was making meticulous word choices. He was editing for style just as much as for content, even when he was writing on the computer. That's not at all an answer to your question you wanted to ask, but it's a start.
No, I thought the question would be, it depends on a deeper analysis than you had time to do. But I was just curious because this is, a problem that I suppose there is some Cavellian resonance with the idea that material conditions could change your way of writing and the content, what you write. But that's something that I am wondering. So is there any questions? I think Arata was also a student of Cavell, right? Arata. And I don't know about Richard, perhaps if you could take this opportunity, since we are kind of restarting the conference with some biographical information and say something about Cavell, I would love to hear you, but we perhaps discuss with Eric.
Well, sure. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks a lot for that, Eric. That was really something. I sort of uncanny, for me, since I spent some time in that house. See those pictures. Actually, I haven't been in the house since Cavell's death, and so it's I guess one thing you didn't talk, and this is just like the geography, so to speak, of the house. I mean, his study was upstairs, of course, and then when I went over, I mean, it was just a practice, that he would meet his students at his house. And often it's like students would go over to his house, and then, if it was near lunchtime, which is often the case, actually, like we would go over to his favorite Chinese restaurant, or maybe the favorite sort of local restaurant. I'm sure you've many people have heard about this, and we go into the restaurant, and everyone who worked there knew Stanley by name. He was a regular there. I don't know if he ever went there on his own, but it seems like my friends who were fellow graduate students, they all, every time they went to go see Cavell, they would all end up at the Chinese restaurant, yeah. So, but we'd also, like all the students would spend time in Cavell's house, inside it, usually in the dining room area, which is adjacent to what you were calling the music room, or just is fairly continuous with it, right? And And one like striking thing about it was that the students were like invited into his home and into his life. You know, it wasn't. I mean, I didn't. You know, there's. You know, some professors would have students over to their house, you know, if they work particularly closely with them, you know, eventually, but at least initially, you know, they would meet at school, you know, in the department office. I think my sense is that with Cavell, it was like immediately, you know, the students would be invited to his house. And then like when you got there, life was going on inside the house, you know, so sometimes Kathleen would be there. Sometimes, you know, these, you know, when I was a graduate student, David and Ben were still growing up, you know, and seemed like they grew up like disconcertingly quickly from my point of view. But anyway, they and so you'd be like sort of thrust into his life, you know, and like you said, you know, I think like life and philosophy were for him just kind of inseparable. And it was just, and that was like exhibited in his practice, you know, the way that he sort of invited students in. All the students, you know, like immediately got to know Kathleen the same time that you got to know Stanley. And then often, you know, you go to the Chinese restaurant, we come back, you know, and sit around and just chat, you know, in the dining room. And sometimes it would just, you know, like Kathleen would participate too. So, and so, yeah, I mean, it was really incredibly lovely, you know, the way that he sort of invited students in. But like, I think I went upstairs to his study. I think once, I think he was looking for a book or something like that. But in general, like I never really got a good look at the study, you know, where he worked. And I don't know I don't know how much he worked in the study versus, you know, working in the kitchen. I don't know if you probably know more about this than I do, Eric. But you know, as you mentioned, like there are like tons of books in the study, and there was evidence that that there was like papers lying around sometimes, you know, around the table, and so there was evidence that he worked, you know, in both places. But yeah, and the other, like he did have an office, right? And he had tons of books in his office as well. I mean, so like one question I had was just, you know, did I you know, I imagine that I'm sure that at this point that office is no longer there. I mean, physically it's there, but it's no longer, you know, it wasn't preserved in the way that a study was preserved. So do you know what happened to the contents of the office? Did they move into were they moved into his study, and was there any a record kept, you know, of what was in his office versus what was like in his study? I mean, I have a bunch of questions, but that's sort of, yeah, like just a simple question.
Thanks, Arata. I think that I know there are photographs of David and Kathleen and Stanley moving them, and David's wife moving Stanley out of the office, moving Cavell out of the office. But I don't think any record was made in terms of what books or papers were there as opposed to what was in the house. I certainly don't have that record, so I don't think that it exists.
I see. I do remember, I think it might have been with, I don't remember if it was with Jim Conant or with Stephen Offelt, or maybe it was with both, that at one point, like Stanley wanted some stuff moved from the office, and like packed up into boxes. So I remember like helping out with that, but I don't remember really anything more than that. But because I don't think he worked in his office that much. He didn't really seem to spend a lot of time in his office. Even when he came into the department to teach, it almost seemed like it was a place where he would just like leave stuff. Yeah. But did you? I guess one question I have is, I mean, it's a pretty basic question. Did he leave any instructions about or guides himself? With regard to his literary state, and or is it just? Yeah, I mean, did you have any guidance, either from him or from anybody else about how to proceed?
Yeah. So Kathleen, his wife, is a literary executor, and she, as I was talking to the Vanderbilt librarians, I, gave her the big picture plans, and everything was kind of okayed by her. There were several people that dropped by over the summer who live in Boston to just kind of see what was going on. But as far as details of what he wanted done with the papers or anything like that, that is totally in the hands of the literary executor, and not a lot of explicit direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have more questions, but I should let others. I like to hear what.
One question I would have, I'm not sure how much of this Eric is really is not on his purview, but do you have any sense of what we can see published in the future besides that volume, like original papers, collections, and on topics perhaps, or just a curiosity?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that decision will not be up to me. But in terms of what I found doing this project, not only was there the book here and there, Sites of Philosophy, there were the journals, there was unpublished essays on Austen, one or two on smaller stuff on Emerson and Shakespeare, an unfinished essay on Dewey, very late 2008. There were wonderful letters to everybody whom you would imagine, including some real rock stars, like a couple directors. So I think there's a lot in terms of what could be interesting. And someone asked me, okay, so there's unpublished stuff. Is there anything new? And that's, I think, a difficult question for Cavell, and one that I hope to get some clarity on, during this workshop. But he was constantly going over the ground that he had already himself traced. But I think he was doing that in order to then move forward. So I think even in the last the stuff that he was writing towards the end of his life, there's a lot of new thoughts to share. So, yeah, short answer, Leonidas, not up to me, but in terms of what I found, extraordinary amount of work.
Of course, thank you. Fernando, I think, has a question.
No, actually, my question was pretty much the same you asked right now, so never mind.
I would have a very a quick question, maybe a bit hard, but let's see. How exactly did you feel being there? Because there is something so very personal about being someone's library, someone's personal library, and seeing the way they pile their books, what books they put together, what other stuff there was there. I saw there were instruments around the house. So how exactly did you feel? Because it is always something so personal, but Cavell's writing is also that. I feel like I was never so much in touch with a philosopher who's not from anywhere near where I live, who's I never met, who I will never get the chance to meet, even. And it's still, when I read him, I feel close to him, even when I don't understand him at all. So I would like to know, how exactly did you feel? Because even seeing the images here in Brazil, I feel something kind of bittersweet, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to discuss that form of his philosophy more. But in terms of how I felt, it was a project. It was work, and I wanted to do it very well. And I tried not to, make it about me. But the family would tease me because at the beginning of the project, I actually took my shoes off every day before going into the study. I felt very much like I was entering some sort of ground that was, that I needed to tread lightly on, literally. But I will say, and I do have a piece coming out about this, being that close to Cavell's work, seeing his meta philosophy in action, so to speak, it was a real shock to the system in terms of the futility of imitating him. There was really a sense that this was a perfectionist practice that was a part of his life, like Arata was saying, and of course we can seek to understand that, but in terms of one's own philosophy, it felt very much like, even though I was getting so close to it, I was also drifting apart or finding distance.
Oh, Richard? We're not hearing you, Richard. Sorry. No. You are not muted, but we can't hear you. Perhaps you can take the plug of the...
Oh, that's...
No. Perhaps you have to... I don't know. Who knows? Turn on the microphone on your computer. I have no idea. It depends on your...
Maybe it would be quicker if he just type his question in the private chat. It's on the right side of your screen.
Yeah, that could work.
I just turned on.
Oh, now it's on.
Yeah.
Great.
It's a bit changing the subject, but I'd be curious to know, Eric, more details about how you got involved in this project, what your background in Cavell studies was, who your teachers were, how much Cavell work you did prior to getting involved in this project, and so forth.
I think my best qualification was time, but I say that sort of tongue in cheek. So my Cavell background is, I wrote my undergraduate honors thesis on Cavell, then went to the Chicago conference in 2012 on his work in aesthetics and met him, and really learned a lot from that conference. I kind of drifted away from Cavell in graduate school, and then in the last 2 years realized that it was really Stanley Cavell who had shown me a possibility of something that I wanted to do with philosophy. And I started writing on him during my last 2 years of graduate school. So my dissertation was on Cavell and skepticism. And I met the family at a conference on Cavell's work at UC Santa Barbara in spring of 2019. So just a few months before I started this project. And I will say, if I hadn't just finished a dissertation on Cavell, this whole work would have been impossible. I mean, I think that it would have taken, 10 times as long, just because I had a good sense of what this, where if I found some notes to something that was clearly had to do with cities of words or with his autobiography or with Must We Mean What We Say, it was pretty clear to me what it was.
I have perhaps one comment, not a question, but you said something about the futility of imitating Cavell's style, and I was recalled of when I was writing my PhD dissertation about Cavell at some point. It was initially supposed to be about Wittgenstein, and then I kind of discovered Cavell, and it changed it completely. His reading of Wittgenstein from the reading I was used to, and inevitably I had to change my style for some reason. And perhaps at some point I was trying to imitate Cavell or something like that, and I remember my supervisor Paulo Faria saying something like, "We don't want to write like Cavell," or something like that. And I was shocked, and I started to think about that, and I don't know what exactly he meant by that, but I think I don't know if I speak for anyone else here, but there is some kind of temptation to do that. I think there is with Wittgenstein too. Some of his pupils did precisely that. I think Anscombe, for example, her style is so close to Wittgenstein's own, and Cavell has his own style. It's kind of difficult. I remember reading The Claim of Reason for the first time, and just it was just impossible to understand for some reason, or to follow. I was expecting something much more, closer to analytic philosophy, perhaps. But then you do that again and again and again. At some point, things start to work, and there is a temptation. How can you write philosophy once you become aware of the need to pay attention to the temptations and the voice of correction, and so this is just a comment, as I said, but I think it is a temptation for someone who is as impressed by Cavell's work to start doing that. And perhaps you can say something about what was the solution in your case, or what you tried to do not to imitate Cavell.
I don't have a good answer to that. I would be interested in how other people have solved that problem in their own cases. I would like to raise the question of whether that perceived closeness that Cavell makes you feel or experience as you're reading him, can best be understood as a kind of form, almost like a literary form of philosophy. But in terms of your specific question, Jonas, I don't have a good answer to that.
I don't know if I have. It's just something that bothers me. But I had to think about that for some time. So, well, any other questions, comments?
I have a quick question. It's going back to the issue we discussed in the beginning about your findings, Eric. And thank you for the presentation. It was lovely to see and to learn about it. You said that there are marginalia in copies of books that he returned to over the years. Do you think those materials, I don't know, are worthy of being collected and being, if not published by a press, I don't know, made available online? Is there any plan to digitize the materials? I mean, what really is the plan for those papers? I mean, it's great that they're being kept by a library, but it would be better, especially in days of Corona, if they were scanned and made available to everyone. I mean, in particular cases, I can imagine it would be interesting to check, when you read a paragraph in Austin, in Wittgenstein, in Heidegger, what did Cavell have to say about that? And it would be nice if we could just open the digitized copy of his work and look. So can you tell us a bit about the plans?
You know, a lot of these discussions got interrupted due to COVID. So, you know, I didn't even finish the inventory. So I don't think there are any plans at this point, but that would definitely be something that would be better asked to the literary executor. But Gilly, on your question about do I think would be worthwhile to have that, I feel resounding yes for the Cavell scholarship and for teaching Cavell to be able to say, you think spending an hour with Heidegger is a lot in prep for this class. Take a look at section 22 of Being in Time, and the one thing that was very clear to me was two things about his marginalia. One was he would go in these cycles, so you could see like through the colored pencil or through the different kinds of pencils he was using, the rounds of reading. You couldn't date them obviously, but you could get a vague sense. And then the other thing was page numbers in the margins. So he'd underline words and then circle it, and then in the margins he'd write a page number. And then if you go to that page number, you found a reference to the page you were just on. And then you could sort of trace his connection. And often, just like reading him, that connection was not clear until he made it clear. And then it seemed as if it was, like a color right in front of you. So yes, that I think it would be really valuable. And I think those conversations are just got put on hold.
Can I follow up on that? So yeah, just to follow up on what Gilly was asking. So I think you mentioned that there were like some course notes, lecture notes, and like preparatory notes for courses in the files as well. I guess one question I have is like how far back those go. And I know that, like he gave a number of courses, for example, on, when I was in grad school there, he gave a number of courses on Lacan, but he hasn't actually written that much on Lacan. He gave, number of courses on Heidegger. Gave one course on Being in Time. He gave a course on some of Heidegger's later writings. I think there was a whole entire seminar on Heidegger's Nietzsche books. And he told me that when he was at Berkeley, when he was starting out his teaching career, the first course he was assigned was a course in the Critique of Pure Reason. And I remember, like, he told me a little bit about how he did that course, but it would be really cool to to see like his lecture notes or course prep notes for those things that he didn't publish that much about. I mean, obviously these figures are very influential for him, and they did inform his writing, but as far as like explicit mention of them, there's not that much, it seems like, in his writings. So I guess the question is like how much of that stuff is there is just a question. I mean, I guess there's a further question of like whether it should be published, how it should be published. If not published, how else should it be made available, in a library, and if so, how, how should it be organized and so on. I mean, there's like a lot of sort of questions that would need to be answered, but that could be, very useful, I think, for future studies of Cavell, were those notes, if they exist, to be like made available in some form. I mean,
Arata, we can speak privately, but I would say, I would encourage, if you have time, I would encourage you to get back in touch with Kathleen on that. I can say that they're all there. I mean, I know the Lacan seminar is there. Tons of notes on being in time, and now that I'm thinking about it, the Heidegger Nietzsche seminar is also there.
Mm-hmm. What about what is critique of pure reason? That goes way back. So I'm just I was wondering just how far back these notes go.
I personally think that your work on his Kantian he is maybe clearer than his own understanding of it. But I'm just thinking. I'm saying that somewhat facetiously. I'm thinking back, and I think there are, yes, early notes that were difficult to decipher on the critique of pure reason. That would be quite a project to transcribe those notes but yes, they're there.
Just another curiosity, but connected to this, is in his digital files, or perhaps Arata knows about somewhere else. Are there recordings, like audio recordings of his lectures that perhaps we could find somewhere? I just saw him on 2 or 3 YouTube videos. It would be wonderful to have, a recording of his lectures.
Yeah, I would. That's a good question. I mean, I know that like just having attended many of his classes, I know that there were students who recorded them. I don't know if those recordings still exist. They were on cassette tapes for the most part. I don't.
Yeah. There are Bernstein tapes and things like that. So perhaps, who knows, some Cavell tapes come up at some point.
Yeah, I mean, these were mostly students, I think, who were recording the classes, and like, I mean, students like move around a lot. I think they like move from place to place. Year by year, they get kicked out of their apartment or something for some reason, and they have to move, and so they're like. I could imagine that it would be very easy, even if they wanted to, to keep these tapes, that these tapes could sort of be lost in the process. I know that, like, I taped a bunch of stuff. I don't know if I don't remember if I taped any of Cavell's classes, but I have no idea where any of those tapes are. So I think I probably did tape some of Cavell's classes, actually.
If you are a former student of Cavell, and you are hearing this conversation and you have tapes, please let us know. Thank you. Anybody else? Oh, I think we are more or less on time. Would you like to have some final words, maybe, Eric? Or if you don't.
The only thing I would say is I hope that these materials become public, and that we can continue to discuss them, because there's so much to learn from them.
Yeah, I share the feeling. Well, thank you again, Eric, for this wonderful presentation. Thanks everybody for being here and discussing. We will meet in about 1 hour. 4 p.m. local time, to discuss Fernando's paper. So please come back if you can. See you soon. Bye.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.